we have Rob Lee, who's the CEO and founder of the industrial ICS and OT cybersecurity company Dragos, considered to be a pioneer in the ICS threat intelligence and incident response community. Rob was awarded the InfoSec's 2015 Cybersecurity Professional of the Year and also inducted into the Forbes 30 Under 30 for Enterprise Technology in 2016. You currently serve on the Department of Energy's Electric Advisory Committee, also on the World Economic Forum Subcommittee on Cyber Resilience for Oil and Energy, and you've testified before the US Senate. That must have been fun. So Rob, welcome to the IoTSec Australia's Thought Leadership Series. We are very pleased to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So firstly, congratulations on your continued success with Dragos. I've been following your blog and also the CyberWire podcast in interest for a while now. Can you give us a quick rundown, or the viewers a quick rundown of your career and how you went from, the US Air Force, seconded to the NSA, and now to the CEO of one of the hottest, I guess, OT cybersecurity companies?
Yeah, accidents, luck, good beer. No, so I started out, as you mentioned, the Air Force. I had a background, not as an engineer, as an operator or anything like that, but my background was in control systems, not in cybersecurity, but I had a love of computers and technology. So the Air Force had me going and spending summers in places like Cameroon, building wind turbines and water filtration units and things like that. By the time that I actually sort of commissioned as an officer and moved into cyber warfare operations, they called it, that's when they said, hey, you should do cyber stuff. And I was like, hey, I like this control system stuff. And they're like, what's control systems? And like, it's everything. Like, oh yeah, like utilities. I'm like, no, your aircraft, your manufacturing, like everything. And I think that took them by surprise. And so I ended up getting moved over to the National Security Agency, and they told me, go find the unknown unknowns. I was like, what is that? Like, we have no idea. Just go figure it out. I'm like, oh, okay. And so at that time, I ended up focusing on industrial control systems. I figured if there was any new states worth their expertise, that they were cool and interesting, and probably be targeting power systems and energy systems at some point. And lo and behold, we ended up finding there was a bunch of unique threats and the unique ways they were targeting these systems. It wasn't things we were familiar with at the time. So that was really cool. It was cool to see. Spent my time doing that. And then at some point, as the US government started looking at things like offense, I decided to leave. I'm a big defensive fan. And I was really just going to stick it out teaching at SAMS. I built the ICS Incident Response and Network Monitoring class there. It was like the first in the community. It was really cool and fun and just enjoyed teaching. And then the Ukraine 2015 attack happened. So it was the first time ever a cyber attack took down electric power, and I got called up to investigate that. And really, to tie a long story short, it was in the aftermath of that when I saw everyone from the White House to CEOs around the world of these large companies essentially thinking that they would just take their enterprise cybersecurity strategy and copy and paste it into their industrial environment. I turned to my now co-founders and said, look, I'm not sure I want to do a software company. I'm not sure I've ever wanted to aspire to be a software company, but the only way to scale human knowledge fast enough is software. And I'd really like my son to have lights and water when he grows up. So we got to do this thing. And we jumped out. They jumped out. We started the company. And I think the rest of it really is just a benefit of our community. We wouldn't be able to be around. We're over 200 people now and been kind of cool and crazy and growing quickly, and got teams down in Australia as well. And I think the only reason we are successful is that our asset owners and operators, these folks out in the community, allow us to be successful. It's folks that are kind of taking the journey of, you know what, we're going to protect our industrial infrastructures differently. Let's focus on people that are actually focusing on this problem instead of taking a more generic approach. And it's those folks that allow us to persist.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple of points there, which I'd like to sort of drill into. But I guess the first question I've got is, so I take it you're not on the tools as much now, being the CEO of a cybersecurity company.
Yeah, it is always an interesting thing to watch yourself get less and less relevant. Where I can confidently say I'm the least important person in the company, but it was very obvious at one point when, I think myself to be a pretty decent incident responder, and I've got some good cases under my belt. And I remember going to my head of incident response, and I had like some extra time, and those new case, I was like, oh, cool, yeah, I'll jump on. And like looked at me and like elevator eyed me. He's like, no, we're good. And I was like, man, any company in the world would let me walk in and do this, but at my own company, I'm not good enough.
The funny thing is, it was I had a very similar discussion. This is going back about 6 or 7 years ago with Kevin Mandia, who founded Mandiant. He said, look, at some stage it just got to the, he was doing CEO stuff. Not that he enjoyed it as much, but, in order to fulfill the mission that Mandiant had, he said he just had to step away from the tools. So
yeah, Kevin's a great example of that too. Like he was, first of all, brilliant guy. But second of all, he's done an exceptionally good job of sort of being tossed the car keys of that and keeping it going. So good guy.
Yeah, fantastic. And you also mentioned the 2015 attack on the Ukraine power grid, and I guess that's where I first sort of came across you. It was either like a CBS News thing or a SANS sort of webcast that you'd covered that in detail. And I guess for here in Australia, it was one of the first times outside Stuxnet, which is I think around 2010, that we really got to see the inner workings of an OT ICS attack. And then obviously the Wired article, which is now the famous Wired article, which put a little bit more of a dramatic, sort of mainstream spin to that. But since 2015, I guess attackers haven't been resting on their laurels, etc. A lot has been happening, albeit a lot of it under the, because of the critical infrastructure, etc., and the sensitivity. We don't hear about it as much as breaches in the IT space.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
It's a weird balance to strike. Yeah, so it's really rough, and I don't want to make light of it at all, but you have, without a doubt, awareness to the problem drives focus on it, creative people get involved, and you get some really good answers. But at the same time, advertising these things out can be very problematic to folks in really two ways. One, there's not a lot of nuance when it comes to stock markets and investors and things like that. And a lot of these companies are stock owned and similar. And the moment you're talking about not a PII breach or email breach, but a breach that may deal with intellectual property of a company or safety or national security topics, the hype just goes crazy.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to have a nuanced discussion. The second problem is a lot of the attacks that we see are completely different than what you'd expect in IT. And I'm not saying there's not IT portions of them, but when it comes down to what we are concerned about most, it's not in some new exploit, malware, or vulnerability. Like those exist, that's fine. But the worst part of these attacks is the tradecraft. It's here's how you turn off electric power with the digital relay.
Yeah.
Here's how you modify a safety system. And so it's blueprints every time of this is what you would do. And so by advertising those things, you can very quickly scale that capability to other adversaries, and you just got to be very, very careful around that. So for us, even though we're a software technology company, we also have an incident response team, and that team is involved in far less cases than I think the public would imagine, but way more cases than any practitioner in the industry would expect.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of stuff happening, and we are fortunate to keep it out of the media. But to your point, to the point I think you're going down, it can be difficult for folks to actually get insight into, well, what should we be doing if you're not actually staying up with that?
Yeah. And and again, you touched on a really good point. Often when I talk to executives in that, who are in the critical infrastructure sector, etc., I often use the analogy that yes, there are similarities between IT and OT security, but there are vast differences, right? Vast nuances, etc. Even in, you mentioned tradecraft, adversaries can be very different. I find adversaries in that OT space need to be, I won't say a lot more skilled, but need to have a unique skill set because the systems they're attacking are quite complex in and of themselves.
Yeah. It is as much engineering as it is cybersecurity as an adversary at the end of it. And I think it's an interesting point when you look at these attacks where in IT, and there's no obvious stereotypes to put on any one industry, but typically speaking, in enterprise security, you're often dealing with system security, like, hey, let's make sure admin or root isn't gotten gained on a system, or you're dealing with things like data security. And you're very often dealing with a high frequency of attacks, but low impact. Thousands of things you got to deal with on a daily basis, not necessarily one of them going to bring down your company. In OT, you're dealing with system security. I don't care that you compromise a single system. I care, do you know how to modify the physical environment or how to take advantage of multiple systems working together? And you're dealing with low frequency, high impact attacks. And so it's just a complete, cognitive shift for how you're actually going to do security in those environments. And to your point, if you're an adversary, it sounds easy. Oh, it's ICS security. There's not a lot being done. I can just jump on and do something. No, those systems may not be designed with a lot of security, but they're designed to be resilient. They're designed to be reliable, and that lends to a natural level of security. So you do need to know what you're doing if you want to be able to have impact that you can understand.
Yeah, and going back to that Ukraine, the attack on the Ukraine power grid, and reading through the analysis of that, it's obviously the adversaries had intimate knowledge of the engineering systems in those particular power plants, which must have taken a while to sort of develop. Right, it's not something you can just script kiddie could develop.
In our analysis of that case, like a lot of the folks focused on Black Energy 2, Black Energy 3 malware, and that's nice, but that was just the enterprise stuff. By the time they got down into the control centers and they were dealing with distribution management systems, our analysis is they were there for at least 6 months interacting with that stuff before they actually execute the attack. And you never know, like, how long could they have done it and they waited for some other reasons, but it didn't look like they were expert even at the time they did the attack. They had learned just enough in that 6 months to do it. But what was really interesting, in my opinion, is the 2015 attack was the first one. And what we could tell from sort of the forensics of it was that there was at least 20 people involved in the attack just from the timing of opening and closing the digital relays and disconnecting substations. And so it was all kind of a very manual attack. By the time it happened again in 2016, but at the transmission level, and they essentially codified that knowledge into software, and that was the crash override malware.
Wow.
And really all they did was learn how to do it, then script it out, and then try to make it scalable, which gives me a little bit of concern about where we're going. And again, I try not to hype things up, but I don't think we're in a space today where it's a hair on fire. Oh my gosh, there's so many attacks. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, and yes, you need to take it seriously, but calm down is kind of my answer to a lot of people at times. But where we're going as an industry is much more to hyperconnectivity, the sort of digital transformation story, common operating platforms, homogeneous systems. You start to get to a place where you get scalability in your attacks. And when you get to that stage, not only is it state actors, but you're going to start seeing criminal actors take much more advantage of that. And you don't go into an industrial environment and just do security. These are like 3 to 5 year roadmaps at a minimum for these companies. Yeah. And so I think that kind of event horizon coming up is a little bit more where I'm concerned.
Yeah, you're right. And a lot of these systems, the security portion of these OT systems really only get upgraded when they do the capital refreshes and that of the underlying OT systems. And I've seen that over the last 10 years, where you'll get particularly in power, where you'll get like a refresh program running along. It's like, oh, we'll add a small line item for security. It could be multiple millions of dollars, but it's how they fund it. And it's unlike the IT security, enterprise security, where upgrades in that occur much more frequently, in terms of 1 to 3 year event horizons. So I guess one of the interesting things that the approach that you guys take at Dragos is that a lot of the OT, let's say, security providers that I work with, often take an infrastructure view on the challenge. So they'll install sensors, take a baseline, look at deviations of the baseline, and then, we got an alert, could be a fault, could be an exploit. We'll get the security team to look at it. But you have a heavy, I guess, reliance on threat intel, as well as incident response, etc. Can you talk a bit about that and sort of why you went down that path?
Yeah, and I just got a brand new puppy that's now destroying my room. So I'm gonna be unprofessional for a second, grab the puppy, and then tell you all about that.
Yeah, please do.
As it's my pandemic puppy. No, but yeah. So look, I don't want to dismiss anybody doing any security in ICS.
Yeah.
And now, if it just flat out didn't work, I would happily say that. But if you're doing something, then good on you. And so that's sort of how I'll start out. That being said, I'm not a big fan of the idea that I'm just going to baseline things and identify anomalies. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, there's a whole lot of changes that happen in industrial networks. And I'm not talking as frequent necessarily as Facebook and YouTube, sessions in your enterprise, but the idea that these are highly static environments that never change and nothing ever goes wrong is not true.
Yeah.
Second of all, a lot of the baselining or using machine learning or whatever to kind of profile your networks, what happens to reduce the amount of alerts people will get is they'll then start whitelisting out communications. They'll say, well, this one is okay.
Yep.
And there we go. And that this communication is normal in my environment. The problem is the attacks we're seeing are leveraging native functionality. Yep. So the thing that I whitelisted out today is the attack path in a week. Mm-hmm. And then the third and final point is if you take a environmental based detection, which is baselining, modeling, whatever else, you sort of think of there. The problem is you might get the alert,
yes,
but you don't have the context of what you're looking at. So it says, hey, something's changed, or a project file is uploaded to the PLC. I'm like, why do I care? What's the context of this? And so from did I get the detection? Yeah, you got a detection. Do I have any idea about what to do now? Nope, not so whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy in a software vendor perspective to go, we'll baseline your environment. Because you just pushed all of the hard stuff to the user.
Yeah.
And I think as a vendor, it's your job to do the hard stuff. That's what you're getting paid for.
Yeah.
And so the secret sauce of Dragos isn't machine learning, AI, and blockchain or whatever. We have none of that. I mean, sure, every product got machine learning in it, but the whole focus of what we're doing is productizing human expertise. It's, hey, we're going to go do instant response engagements. We're going to have our intel team track adversaries. We're going to learn what the patterns are, the behaviors, the threat behaviors, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, if you will. And we're going to codify that into analytics. And we're going to put a bunch of context into when you see event 1 plus event 2 plus event 3 within a 60-minute window. It's a SCADA hijack. Here's what's going on. Here's where we've seen it before. Here's how to investigate it.
Yeah.
And what we have found is that has armed our customers very, very well to have knowledge on what to do and then not have to deal with alarm fatigue. Now it's not 100,000 alarms a day. It's, hey, here's some lower lying behaviors we can investigate and hunt in if we're interested. But here's the higher ones that if this goes off, we need to take a look at it and see what's going on. And I think there's a lot of value in that, even in not in ICS. And we're seeing kind of the industry talk a lot about that with MITRE ATT&CK and sort of how to go to threat behaviors. But the idea of being able to do event correlation at the point of detection, kind of streaming, instead of bringing everything back into a SIEM or log aggregator and trying to run batch analytics across it is a topic that the larger industry will go to. And it's just that it's something that we're doing on the OT side. I won't say first, but there are very few companies that are actually doing that kind of streaming analytics at the edge, if you will.
And the other reason why I like your approach is that it helps to do the knowledge transfer to the client as well, rather than have the client rely solely on you as a provider. And often, like one of the larger oil and gas companies that I've worked with, they were in the process of integrating their OT and ITSOC, for efficiency, etc. And the challenge I had was that, of course, their level 1 SOC team could take the alerts, from OT environments as well as an enterprise environment. But the challenge was, it was an alert. Is it a fault? Is it an exploit? How can you tell? And then by the time they start engaging the OT engineers, it gets lost in translation. So I think that approach helps.
I'm a big fan when it comes to security operations. If you're doing security operations, I'm a big fan of a dedicated OT SOC, but I don't mean build out a whole other team, whole other budget, to me, a SOC is just people, process, and technology.
Yes.
So I want a shared tier 1 SOC, no problem. Have the alerts come up into the tier 1, throw them all into whatever SIM of your choice, no problem. But the moment that it's something from the ICS that looks interesting enough to escalate, I want dedicated, trained OT security operations professionals that understand the business, understand what's going on, can pivot into something like our tech that has context of the environment around it. What am I looking at, et cetera. And then for me, the tier 3 isn't some hyper specialized forensics person. It's somebody at the plant or at the mine or at the site that can understand the impact and go, oh, okay, this is actually pretty important to us, or nah, that's just GE. That's the conversations that need to happen. And that person becomes essentially your cyber champion. And what I find often is the biggest barrier whatsoever is just the culture piece. Is IT and OT not even talking right? Forget the OT security, but just the plant folks are already understaffed. They're already doing a million things.
Yes.
They see the IT folks as these people up in headquarters that are doing email servers. And it's this weird characterization that we apply to each other. But the moment you've got your cyber champion, if you will, down at the mine. It's like, oh no, I work with Bob.
Yeah.
Bob will take care of us. Here's what is going on. And you can actually get to success.
Yeah. No, I get that. And that's the challenges that we ran into time and time again, is that the level 2 to level 3 handoff. Because often, certain, companies talking mining, often mine sites, like the site that we were working on, it was 2 sites, and the 2 sites that were on the one sort of property had completely different OT equipment in there. One was, I think, a cement shop. The other one was ABB sort of Rockwell equipment. And so the contacts that we had, like multiple contacts there to try and interface with. And I think the challenge is basically when it becomes a cultural and a process one, and hard to productize into a sort of an orchestrated, generally what you would term as a SOC. So at the moment, I think it's still largely that process handoff, and to ensure that it's almost ITSM, ensure that whole process works well, because when it happens in real life in terms of an attack, as you would well know, whatever sort of gaps that you have there will become, chasms.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a lot of companies getting it right, but I do still see quite a bit of opposition in the industry at any given turn, where folks go, well, that's just a Windows system. Why are we trying to be weird about this? Like, because it's operating physical equipment.
Yeah.
All OT is all the IT stuff, plus physics. Like it's that physics piece that's really the interesting piece. And in some companies, like I said, they get it right. They're like, oh no, we're going to go learn operations. Let's do this. And in some it's, deploy EER on the Windows system and we're done. We're like, well, most of it you can't. And okay, guys, you're not helping yourselves out. And that's a challenge. And again, it sometimes goes back to that cognitive bias piece where folks go, well, I see all the attacks in the enterprise. I have to deal with this day to day. We never see any attacks in the ICS. Why would I care? Yeah. It's like, well, are you monitoring it? Well, no. Well, then you're not going to see anything. Like, of course, you're never going to be having your attention.
You're not looking. Yeah. If you're not looking, you're not going to find them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned just in your what you said earlier was the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I know your team. I've seen a number of webinars where your team have sort of co-presented with the MITRE group on that. And for those who are familiar with the enterprise and mobile attack, the OT or ICS attack is the variant for industrial control systems. From that perspective, using the ICS attack framework, what for you are the most sort of useful use cases using that framework?
Yeah, there's quite a few. For me, the history of MITRE ATT&CK is also interesting, and I'll add that in, which I don't know how public this is, and probably with good reason. But MITRE ATT&CK started at the NSA, and it wasn't like and MITRE and the NSA have a lot of good connections, anyways. But from an NSA perspective, when we were tracking cyber threats, the idea of doing it with just indicators or atomic detections, it was really, really difficult, especially when you start talking hyperscale. When you talk one network, like, okay, when you're talking the visibility that a global intelligence agency can have, indicators don't cut it. And so we moved really early on to tracking TTPs or behaviors and going that direction. And then really it was the idea of, okay, well, if this is good for the goose, it's good for the gander. Let's figure out how to get this out to the community. And MITRE picked it up and ran with it and did some amazing work on codifying that. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really important is it gives a lexicon. Number one use case is it gives a lexicon to everybody to go, we can all know what we're talking about by using this sort of framework. Now, what I like to do with it is numerous, but number one, I love to think about it from an instant response and kind of tabletop exercise approach, where I can map out, here is the kind of ICS cyber kill chain, and here's kind of the TTP overlay of what Electrum looks like in the Ukrainian electric system, or what Xenotime looked like when they targeted petrochemical safety systems. And I can overlay exactly what those are, and then just have a good conversation well ahead of any technical work of, do you think you have preventative, detective, and responsive controls against these tactics? And you can just have that upfront conversation, go, I don't think so. When you save yourself the assessment, then you go work on those. Or, yeah, I think we do. I'm like, okay, now let's go validate the collection you have in your environment to make sure you would be able to detect that. And then you morph from like the TTX instant response to then going and hunting. And you're kind of planning a hunt off of those tactics. And there's a million different ways to then think about the analytical depth of those tactics. So analytical breadth to me is what coverage of like the 81 tactics in MITRE ATT&CK for ICS do you have. Analytical depth is, what are all the different ways to attack that one tactic? And that gets into some really interesting kind of detection engineering work. Also, though, it's really useful for those that are doing kind of red teaming of let me go emulate an adversary and build out my attack path.
Yeah.
And then also be able to share that with the blue team on here's what we're doing, here's what we did. Were you able to detect us? All right, let's think through this. How can we be collaborative on this? And so that back and forth of kind of IR hunting and red teaming, it to me is really the sweet spot for it.
Yeah, no, I've managed to use that once, because it's fairly new, once in an engagement. It was essentially a purple team engagement where we were brought in to basically facilitate that workshop between the defenders, the blue team, as well as who they had doing their red teaming for them. And exactly as you said, it was a really useful at multiple levels, right, in terms to walk through. A lot more practical than the let's say the kill chain ever was, because it was fairly high level. But yeah, I found it very useful at multiple sort of levels, right? And even leaving it with the blue team, afterwards, in terms of, okay, use this framework to get better, in terms of your detection, in terms of your,
Yeah, there's a lot of models, and I forget the gentleman who made the quote, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. And when you look at being able to combine together MITRE ATT&CK, the diamond model, the kill chain, and then the collection management framework, when you kind of put those four together, you can think through an entire defensive strategy and try to model it out. And it gets really, really powerful pretty quick.
Yeah, absolutely. The only challenge I found in that space is the organizations that use them often don't have the resources, the people, even the budgets to actually do it right. A lot of the large players will do it, mining, the large miners, etc. Even some of the larger power companies here in Australia. But I find there's a plethora of tools, for teams to use. But often the challenge, particularly here in Australia, given the maturity of the OT and ICS security space, often you'll be lucky to have one or two security specialists from an OT perspective inside an organization. So it then comes down to just the resources, people, and process, etc. Have you seen, I guess, in the US, it work well where you've got an MSSP, some sort of managed security service provider for OT environments, or is that concept still fairly new in the US as well?
It's newer, but I think it's been around longer for us, and or at least broader for us, I should say. But I do see some success with that. It's really focused on what you want them to be doing. When it's, hey, I'm going to turn over my security program to you and I have an MSSP, I've almost always seen it fail. When it's, hey, you're going to be part of my team, here's the role I need you to fill, and let's have interaction around what your role is, then I've seen it be successful. And so I think it is a big question of what do you allow when you don't. And I think a lot of the operations side of the house is understandably unfamiliar with and hesitant around like cloud-based work or remote-based work. And that's changing. And so there's now opportunities for it where the industry is already going to quote unquote digital transformation, whatever you want to call it, already seeing a lot of remote work because of COVID and everything else. So I'm going, okay, well, if I'm already doing it for my vendor, why not do it for security as well? So for the folks that aren't doing any cloud, don't introduce it for security. But if you're doing it for other purposes, you might as well introduce it for security as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've been around long enough, but I remember even like 5 years ago, that kind of topic around OT and cloud was taboo, right? It's like, not
a chance.
But as you said, as things change and as whatever you want to call it, digital transformation, disruption, I think the use of cloud will eventually, at some point, probably in the more critical areas, to begin with.
You're seeing companies do things like analytics with historians to get actual economic value. Where it once it's a business case of, hey, I'm going to just do this one thing and we're going to make 15% more in our company. Like, I'm going to do that thing.
No, and I've been on about 3 or 4 engagements over the last year where exactly that, right? They've called it the organizations, and this is across. It was particularly popular in the commercial real estate space. Building management systems, etc., where they start collapsing data from the historians into data from the buildings, data from their HR systems, and they'll usually put it on GCP or Azure or AWS, etc. And then they'll call that as the first in the the convergence of IT and OT. It's like, okay. I mean, it's a good place to start. It's data. You're not accessing any physical systems. If you're going to start somewhere, it
always starts that way. I've seen that one go the other way, right? Where it's like, hey, we don't need it. We don't need to access your control loops. Like, we're not going to do anything. We just want a read-only view on your historian. And here's our industrial box, and it's like bastardized Raspberry Pi,
Yeah.
and they just send data out. But then what happens is the lure of data, and then I can make these decisions, and then
Correct.
I can use this to feed this system to come back in, and then you've expanded your control loop through the cloud, and that's when you got to be really sort of well-minded on it.
Well, particularly in the commercial real estate space, because the way it operates is each of the buildings usually has a building manager that's responsible for the P&L running of that, profit and loss running of that building. And I remember one of the organizations we did that for around collapsing their data platforms into one, putting it on one of the cloud giants platform. We came back 9 months later to assess it, and the actual building management team, the manager there, had gotten another sort of boutique to come in and start connecting their lifts, etc., to this system. And so you've almost, as you said, like you've just created an additional loop to that. So yeah, once you start, right, it's a difficult thing to contain.
Yeah, I think what will help the industrial industry is the safety community.
Yeah,
and I think where we're hyper concerned would be like, oh, are we going to get to a fully unmanned rig, or are we going to get to a fully unmanned mine site? And it sounds like it's coming, but it's probably not. Sure, you'll get reduced manpower. Sure, we already have autonomous vehicles, MineStar and Caterpillar and similar, but from a safety perspective, they're always going to have at least somebody.
Yeah.
And that's been great. And cybersecurity and safety are not one for one, as you know very well, but there are overlaps where cybersecurity and safety do go hand in hand. And I think where we as a community can find those and focus there first and then start building out, I think we'll have a nice little journey ahead of us.
Yeah, correct. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you was, the sectors the industries that you work in, I understand are primarily the common sort of critical infrastructure sectors, power, water, energy. Do you do much? And I here in Australia, there's not much at all in the healthcare in terms of hospitals and the systems that they run.
No, maybe one day, but I'm sure all companies do, or at least I would hope they would. But I really believe that if we don't have something unique to bring to something, we don't need it touching it.
Got it.
And so, would I like to do healthcare systems eventually? Sure, but we don't have something unique to bring there right now, and I don't want to play around when we start talking about health and safety and pretend that we are, our expertise in electric, mining, and rail automatically extend to healthcare. I don't want to fool people that way.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of work on like the classic industrials, and in Australia we are doing an electric and mining and similar. And so it's much more than just like energy. And we have building automation, data. For some reason we got into data centers a lot lately, but no, not healthcare systems yet. Yeah. I think they have some very interesting challenges ahead of them. Mm-hmm. And honestly, from a healthcare perspective, if you take away a lot of the things that we talk about, one of the number one things I focus them on is things like ransomware threat.
Yeah.
And I don't see, maybe this might be falling in my own trap of not monitoring, so I don't see, but like, I don't see as many serious state level actors trying to target a healthcare system.
Yeah.
I see them doing it. Now it's unfortunate. I see them doing it with pharmaceuticals, even with the COVID vaccine and similar, and we're in some of those cases, which is actually kind of sad. But from a hospital perspective, like good backups, plans around ransomware and connectivity, like I would prefer them to start there than buying our stuff.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. And there's we did a market scan. This is going late last year for a large healthcare provider here in Australia, and it was surprising that a lot of the protocols that their equipment used were very different. They weren't traditional DNP, Modbus, BACnet, those kind of protocol stacks, which meant a lot of the off-the-shelf solutions just didn't. They
have a lot of interesting like Siemens MRI technologies and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, okay. Hey, I guess one of the last things I wanted to touch on was you recently penned a blog article around the role of governments in terms of helping to actively defend private sector networks. And here in Australia, it's of particular interest, right? Because our 2020 cybersecurity strategy was released recently, and it's heavily slanted towards government, in terms of defense, but also surprisingly, I found includes provision for the government to step into the private sector networks, critical infrastructure, to help in defending and responding to attacks, right? For those who haven't read the blog, what are your views in terms of what the federal government's, or even government in general's role
Yeah, I wrote that blog because I read the Australian strategy and
Okay.
got
Got it.
kind of heated and wrote it. So look, big fan of ASD and ACSC, and I think government has a great role and responsibility to fulfill. And there's a lot of unique expertise you can develop when you are working at that stage. In the same way that there's unique expertise you can develop anywhere, but it's a unique set of expertise that I do see government folks that come into the private sector bring a lot of value, just like any sort of diversity of thought would. However, there are some big pitfalls that government can fall into, and I'm very probably critical and vocal about being careful on that. Was actually a subject of my testimony back in 2018 in the Senate as well, which is at a government level, you see threats. Got it. You're not actually getting as deep expertise or deep insights as a Dragos, a CrowdStrike, and people doing instant response. They're seeing way more than you're seeing in any classified government sector.
Yeah.
A lot of the government systems and classified systems and signals intelligence and things like that were built on detect the ICBM launch, detect the counterterrorism threat, be able to break into the GRU's headquarters and be able to, satisfy intelligence requirements. They weren't built on let's do intrusion analysis of cyber attacks in the sector and then map out TTPs. Like that's not what it was for. And so first and foremost, it's different.
Yeah.
Second, when you're seeing threats but not getting the closure of fixing them day to day inside the companies, you can get hyped up real quickly. And it's, oh my gosh, look at all this badness. And it only ever gets worse. But you don't see that good companies around Australia, like, Australia Gas and Lights or FMG or Rio Tinto, and these folks are actually doing a lot of good work. And they're actually putting into place security efforts that are really meaningful.
Yeah.
So you don't get that closure. So you're always getting hyped up. On top of that, the private sector, because it's doing the closure, because it's doing the day-to-day work, because it's getting the intrusion data, is developed, and partly because the government has invested as well, is gaining massive expertise. So the question, I think, fundamentally to start with is, if the government took this job off everyone's plate, could they do it, and could they do it better? And I think we are in a resounding no to both of those questions, and have seen that time and time again, including in the US with DHS and others. So right off the bat, if they can't do it and they can't do it better, then it's not a national security interest. One step down, you've got to ask yourself, should they? If a government could use taxpayer resources, should they be competing with tax-paying entities? Correct. And generally in the Western world, I would argue, no, you shouldn't be doing that. And
you're touch on that.
You're honestly competing with the very resources that you then want to consume.
Unless you want to have state-owned enterprises.
Absolutely. One of the best possible things that Western governments particularly have is their private sector to be able to pull in technology and insights and whatever, whenever they want. If you don't think that, and I know you do, but if you don't think that China and Russia and others are heavily concerned about Silicon Valley and startups as a strategic power for the United States, come on, that's absolutely one of their tools to leverage. Hollywood has done more for the English language and influence across the world than anything else. So winding it back down, do I think there's role and responsibility for government? Absolutely. But when government says, I'm signing up to do X, they damn well better do it. They better do it well, because trust is a really easy thing to lose in that position. And so when government signs up to say, I'm going to get involved and I'm going to actively defend your networks, especially when they can't or they're not ready or equipped to, your CEOs will go, oh, okay, I'm done with that. I'm not going to invest in that. Government's got it. No worries. And then the next attack happens, and everyone's looking around going, what the hell? And you've done nothing more than hurt your national security. And so I think, long story short, government needs to be extremely careful with what it does. And I generally like advocacy. I generally like amplification. I like prioritization. I like workforce development. I like incentives. There are sometimes regulations can make sense. Those to me are the tools that government has that it should wield. And it's got to wield the really hard stuff too, where a foreign power is stealing the intellectual property out of key companies in your sector. There is a time that attribution and trying to have a pushback on foreign powers and using tools of the state, either diplomatic or economic, and sanctions. Those are powerful things. And what I see typically happen is governments quickly abdicate their role and responsibility there and then pivot to try to do what's easier. But the easier stuff, the private sector can already do.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement there. And one of the things you said, actually, I spoke to a board director of a large water utility here in Australia, and the chair of the board, and he was saying, well, hey, the cybersecurity strategy has come out. The government's actually committed to help defend our networks. Do we actually have to invest all this money into it? It's like, well, of course, yes. And even though that was a line item in the strategy, the devil's in the details, right? In terms of what they intend to do. And and even if they did, and I don't think they do, but even if they did intend to be that granular in terms of defending even critical networks, they would have to invest 10 times minimum. 10
the number they threw out in the strategy is peanuts.
Yeah, so
it's silly.
I think you're right. There is, for me, there's always a role for government around, regulations where it's required. Like here in Australia, the regulator for the power networks, AEMO, has brought out a framework specifically for power. It's generated over the last year a lot more pragmatic, efforts by power generators, distributors, etc., which has been positive, right? It is a burden. It is an overhead and a cost, but
it happens, yeah.
I think it's working. The water industry is looking at doing the same thing based on the IEC sort of standard. So that's good. So, frameworks, standards, etc. As you said, workforce, skilling up, etc. But I think you're right. Leave the heavy lifting to the private sector, because it's what we're good at.
There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to take over here and you take this and let's come together and do it right. Everything in the world's wrong with, I got it. I got the ball. Yeah. In the United States, the Department of Homeland Security commonly tells people, hey, call us for instant response. We'll do instant response. Yeah. And we go to numbers of companies that you open up their instant response plans, literally call DHS.
Yes.
And we've responded to plenty of those. When they call up DHS and go, cool, activate the instant response team, they're like, no, it's not like an on-the-ground instant response team. Like, we'll be there, but it's to observe and share, the insights the government has. And they're like, what? And so it's not that anybody's being malicious. It's what the DHS considers incident response is not what the private sector considers incident response.
Yeah, that's correct.
And look, I would say 5-10 years ago, I'd be like, oh, okay, it's a mismatch. Oh, no problem. These days, like, y'all know better. This has been around for a while, that as the government, it is appropriate for you to be specific and precise with your language.
Yeah, fantastic. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was, I read a few years ago, actually, you wrote that, maturity in terms of both awareness and what organizations were doing around OT, ICS security was still relatively immature, but improving. I think it was 2017, you wrote that in a blog piece. Where do you see it now in 2020, particularly in the post-COVID era, and where do you see it over the next maybe 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I'm always an optimist about this. And so what I'm not telling people, and I always say be careful, what I'm not telling people is we've done a lot and we're good. Like, if you think about how many, let's just take electric power, which tends to be one of the leading industries on this topic. When you look at the number of electric power companies in the Western world that are monitoring their ICS networks, it's probably like 5%, right? Like, it's not a lot. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying all is well, but holy crap, it's 5%. It's, and what I'm seeing is it's a board level topic.
Yes.
It's not, oh, we should do ICS cyber. It's the board going, well, hold on now. Mm-hmm. Are you saying you weren't doing our whole organization? Because when they gave a cyber budget, they didn't say, go do the enterprise.
Yeah, exactly.
They said, hey, reduce cyber risk across our organization. Mm-hmm. And because of cultural challenges or understanding of the risk at the time or whatever, CEOs found out that they were spending more on their website security than they were on their gas turbine security. Mm-hmm. And they were, what? And now there's an awareness around that. So do I think the awareness is much more than the 5%? Yes. There are very rarely can I walk into a decent sized company and it not be a board level understanding of we've got gaps and we've got to fix them. They may not have the roadmap yet. They may not have it figured out yet, but there is an appreciation that we need to do something. And yes, there is a gap. Mm. That's amazing. Plus, when you look at the number of professionals in our space, it is way different than what it was 10 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. When you look at folks that actually can talk about ICS, they're not just saying, SCADA, right? SCADA. Well, SCADA is one type, and the SCADA. No, it's a DCS versus a PLC versus, you can have a nuanced conversation about this. And I give a lot of credit to SANS for what they've done there, but it's not just them. ISA has done a lot of work. There's a ton of people that have done so much around this community. But now you're not talking about 15 people anymore or 200. talking about thousands of people, not tens of thousands, but thousands of people that can actually have a conversation around ICS security and know they need to be doing something. And I just think that is something to celebrate and get excited about. Do we need to pick up the pace? Of course. Do we need to freak out? No, but let's be measured in what we're doing. But I think that's really cool, and I do think 2020 for me has, besides this being a trash dumpster fire year in many ways, 2020 has brought more conversations where you said in the bio that I'm in the World Economic Forum. Okay, great. You got the World Economic Forum with two different subcommittees, and the conversations we're having with global CSOs in oil and gas and electric are almost entirely on OT and ICS. That's new, and that's exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. I concur, right? I'm a bit of an optimist. Yes, hell, there's a lot of work to be done. But, in terms of the enterprise security, we took a long time over the last 25 odd years to get to where we are now. So hopefully it won't take that long in the OT ICS security space, considering the risks and the risk profile of some of these critical infrastructure providers. Rob, look, thank you. Enjoyed the discussion. I could speak to you, it seems, hours on this, but we only have 45 minutes. Thank you. Much appreciated. And
thanks for having me.
Hopefully we'll have you back on in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, we're as soon as COVID's over, we'll be opening our Melbourne office, and so I'll look forward to spending more and more time in Australia.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.